Today, I'm going to go through a series of announcements. I will also review once again briefly the first assignment, the first written assignment, which is due at the end of this week. Then I will look at the history of the technology of the automobile and the technologies of mobility from two different points of view based on presentations you find on the class wiki. One is what was going on before the automobile, before something that we can call an automobile. And two, we'll go back through history to look at energy sources and mobility, to really understand what came together, all the various discoveries and technological advances that came together to make the automobile possible by the end of the 19th century. Okay? So I mentioned that the Center for Italian Studies, of which I'm the director, is organizing a concorso d'eleganza, a car show on campus on September 7th. It'll be our 19th edition. We already have about 60 vehicles between motorcycles and Italian cars lined up for the event. And every year, I'm looking for volunteers from this class, and I had one last year, one the year before. Of course, extra credit is warranted. Keep in mind that I'm not trying to just exploit students. For example, last year's volunteer was placed at the very table at the entrance of the concorso that was greeting the cars and the car owners when they were coming in, to give them the placard with the card information, the program, etc. So you're not there to move bottles of water, although some of them is also part of the preparations of that. In particular, this year, we are looking for a photographer. So if you have a digital camera that is good enough, if you have some experience, doesn't have to be direct experience with car shows, although that would be preferred, but meaning you know about photography, we would love to have you there to take pictures of the cars. We didn't have one last year, and really when we went back and we put together all the phones, all the pictures from various phones, very few were good enough for our use in the future. So let me know if you're interested, if you have time, and if you have talent. I moved the deadline for the first assignment because next weekend I'll be busy from Saturday with the preparations for the concorso, so I wouldn't have time to open your files anyway. So I won't do that until Monday, therefore I moved up the deadline, which is also good for anyone who just joined the class, right? Sunday, end of the day, post your assignment inside Google Docs. And we have two options for this assignment that you see listed here. They're both described inside week 1. And I have created Google Docs files for every student who registered up until this morning, right? So make sure that you receive the link, right? Links should have gone out with a notification from the Google Drive server. And of course, it's a Stony Brook Google Drive server, so it's not something that should really end up in the spam folder. However, you never know. So make sure, if you're in this class, that you know where to find the file for your assignments. Might be a good idea before the weekend to open that file, write something, make sure that you can access the file, that you can edit the file, okay? If you don't have access or you're not able to write anything in it, just let me know, because I had to create each file by hand and configure it and share it with you. Use your Stony Brook Gmail account, your Stony Brook EDU account to access that file. Don't ask me to use a personal file, a personal email. Just use the Stony Brook email. So make sure that you're logged in with your Stony Brook email in order to be able to edit that file. At this point, frankly, whereas in the past, I would tell students, if you don't like Google Docs, just use whatever editor you're familiar with, and then copy and paste your assignment in the Google Docs file. At this point, given the widespread use and abuse of artificial intelligence, my recommendation would be do the work also inside Google Docs, because this way you have a history, you'll have evidence that whatever you did was the product of your work. It's easier to protect yourself that way. Now, if you go to the syllabus for this class, you will find there is a short paragraph about artificial intelligence and the authorized use of it within this class. And what you will find there is that the ideas, the actual work, should be absolutely your own. It should be original. And as you will see, some of the assignments are more like personal reflections. However, especially if English is not your first language, or if you're trying to achieve a higher level of communication and engagement through the use of artificial intelligence, that would be possible. That is to say, to have the syntax reworked by artificial intelligence, to have some stylistic improvements, and you know that faculty are experimenting with AI as much or more than you do at this point, right? I myself, since Italian is my first language, even though I've been in English-speaking countries since 1990, I find it beneficial for some documents to engage the help of artificial intelligence in a dialogue, trying to achieve the goal that I have in mind in terms of format, style, clarity, engagement. But the ideas that I write are always mine. I'm in control anyway. I'm not delegating to AI the assignment itself, right? And that's dangerous too, because in the past, whenever I found students who had used artificial intelligence, its use was so conspicuous in that for many, if not all of the assignments in this case, artificial intelligence was either providing something generic or was hallucinating badly. I remember in the past that the protagonist, the female protagonist of a novel, of a beautiful novel from the early 1900s, Molly Randolph, became pregnant all of a sudden when the character is not even engaged, and clearly the novel suffers from a strictly normative view of society. They could not even conceive of women engaging in sexual acts or showing that to the readers, women engaging in sexual acts before marriage, right? Or another assignment which is not offered this year had to do with a black car, and an AI just put together things about black cars in different contexts, but not that novel, because again, a lot of the material we deal with have not been widely discussed. So the material is not there, and it's not really worth it. Take the first assignment. You have here some of the instructions that you find under week 1. This is the assignment that is due Sunday, September 7th, by the end of the day. And the title is, Have Cars Lost Their Magic? And even though among my suggestions that you don't see on this screen. You would see them if you scroll down from here. Even though my suggestion is read the readings from week one, the general introduction, the key ideas and concepts for the class to make your reflection more informed, reach a different level of reflection. This assignment should be based on your own personal experiences. How do you feel about the car? Do you feel that the car has some special place in your mind, in your dreams, in your life, in your past life as a kid, perhaps? Do you have toy cars? Did you watch Cars, the Disney movie, or some other film with cars? Did you have some great, unique family memories associated with a car, associated with a trip, with a specific destination, and you were on the road to reach that destination? These would be the kind of content, the material to complete this assignment. And of course, you don't have to be, your point of view doesn't have to be positive, right? It could be negative, or it could be just explaining that you grew up with other dreams, with other memories that were crucial, and the car doesn't occupy any special place there. But you, in that case, you can still discuss what you've seen among friends or within your families, what your parents' relationship with the car might be, or your grandparents' relationship with their cars might be, stories you've heard, etc. Okay? This is 300 to 600 words, 1 to 2 pages, okay? And no research really is involved in this kind of assignment. No footnotes or endnotes or works cited, unless you have a special notion of how to go about this. But it should still be rather personal, right? Based on a personal point of view. There is an alternative, and I've always kept this, especially for students who are doing film studies or film and screen studies, meaning not just cinema, but TV and other media as well. It's based on a wonderful short film. As you can see there, it's 36 minutes. It's available on Amazon. And the idea there, I've talked about this episode in this series called Modern Love, based on a New York Times column, which also offers some interesting articles. And this film is based on one of those articles written by a woman who talks about her dead husband's car, which was an Alfa Romeo, which she kept after he died, and her emotional, sentimental relationship with the car. The car is getting old, is breaking down, has a lot of mechanical issues, and yet she struggled letting go of the car because it's like letting go of a segment of her life. And this is beautifully transformed into this film in the story of this British character played by Minnie Driver. In this case, if you opt for this assignment, again, the bad way would be to have a generic assignment summary of the film or a generic discussion of its content. And the best way to go about the assignment would be to pick one or more scenes where the sentimental, emotional relationship with the car, the fact that the car is like a spiritual instrument. It's how the woman in the film gets in touch with her emotions, her view of her current situation in the world. She has a new partner, she has a new life, yet she's still strongly connected to her past. And when she takes the car and just drives through this beautiful countryside landscape, this is an opportunity for her to dream, to have visions of her dead husband who appears in the car. And also talking to him, she's talking to herself. She's trying to build her future life. So try to, if you opt for this assignment, discuss and analyze how complex the interaction between the character and the automobile is, and what is achieved through these scenes. Okay, you don't have to be a film scholar. You don't have to provide an analysis of the editing techniques, the camera angles. You're still doing cultural studies. You're doing cultural studies through the storyline, the arc of the character, and what you see on the screen, the content of the frames. And if you are able to, with simple apps, with a simple snippet tool, you can also stop the film, get a screenshot, paste it into Google Docs to support your analysis, your discussion of this. Okay? So this is the beginning of today's lecture about the technology of the automobile. However, before I embark in a summary presentation of this page that you find online, I'll be glad to answer any questions about the class, since this is the second week. So it could be something about the contents of the first week, the assignment, or anything else, really. Trying to, Ryan?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So for like all the assignments, right? I understand we post them on the file, but
Yep.
you want us to like do it like on a separate document and then post it?
No. Just do it there and leave it there.
Okay.
If by any chance your work is done before the deadline, in this case before Sunday, add a comment, select the title, and using the comment feature of Google Docs, you can add a comment saying, this is not a draft, I've completed this assignment, so that if I have time, I can just go in, because I'll receive a notification myself if you post a comment, and I know that Ryan is done. So, and I have time, let's say on Friday, I go in and I review it, and then I leave some comments and a grade. It's also something you may want to avail yourself of, the comment feature, to ask for a clarification, right? You can also say, this is a draft, I would, and being the first assignment, I would like to have your feedback so that I can make changes before the deadline, right? And again, I received the notification with your request through Gmail, through my Storybook Gmail account, and I can go in and say, yes, you're on the right track, or you've made it too generic, you should include some personal anecdote or example, etc. Okay? What else?
Thank you.
You're welcome. And one of the things that I suggested you find in the instructions posted at the bottom of each file is that you put the most recent assignment at the top. Okay? So that we know that whatever is done, and we don't have to scroll, either you or I don't have to scroll through the file to find the newest or to put in another assignment. Keep in mind there are only 4 assignments. They're worth 3% of the final grade each, for the total of 12%. Of course, if by any chance on a particular week you need a short extension because you have another assignment, or you have a test or something else that took your time and attention away, just write to me before the deadline suggesting the amount of the extension. I need 1 day, I need 2 days, 3 days. Is it Isabel?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I'm on the main page
Yeah.
for Notion, and I'm just struggling to find the part where I would read about the details of the assignment and submit it. I see a list for lectures and readings and news and announcements, but I don't see where assignments go under that.
No, put them inside this Google Doc file that I shared with you, right? So go back to your inbox, make sure you received a notification. If not, because almost all of the Google Docs file were created during the first week, and this morning I created a few more for people who added after Thursday to the class. So you should have received by Thursday of last week, by August 29th, a link to your Google Docs file. If you can't find it, just write to me. I'll send it back to you. Okay?
Yes, I see.
But
I
that's
see it.
okay. Okay. And as I said, make sure you can open the file and you can edit the file, right? Because I might have missed a checkbox that grants you editing rights, etc. Any other questions? Yes.
If we do both the alternative and the like the regular assignment, if we do both, is it possible to get like extra points for that or no?
No, it might be possible later on. If by the end of the semester something has happened and the circumstances would warrant the offer of an extra credit, that might be an option. But no, it's not an option at this point, and it's something that should be negotiated individually. But I think it's too early to say I need extra credit now, right? So just pick one, whichever you feel more strongly, right, and go with it. Okay. Yes.
So to clarify, we'll just write our responses in the document, and there's nothing to actually submit it.
No, once you're done there, past the deadline, I open each file, check that you've posted an assignment, and I start correcting those assignments. Okay, so you don't have to send me an email saying I've posted the assignment, right? I have access to all the files, and right after the deadline, usually the next morning, I go through, the first thing I do, I go through the assignments, make sure that everyone has posted one, and then I start correcting the assignment. Normally, the deadlines will fall on a Friday. It's Saturday morning is when I correct the assignment. So normally by Saturday afternoon, you should be able to open your file and see a comment and a grade. Okay, but it's not something like a Dropbox inside Blackboard or similar systems where you had to drop a file before midnight of the deadline, otherwise you'd be cut out. You still have access throughout the semester. You'll always have access to the file. You lose access only after the last assignment, which is the final project. So after the deadline for the final project, which I think it's December 12th, then you lose your editing rights. You'll still be able to open the file, view the comments, post a comment, but not edit that. But throughout the semester, you'll always have access to it. But again, given that we don't have an exaggerated, an extraordinary number of students or assignments, if you miss an assignment, write to me right away, right? Let's say you not only missed the assignment, but you didn't ask for an extension. Reach out to me anyway, and we can talk about your missed assignment. Okay? Any other questions? And thank you. I think those questions would be useful to other students as well. So we're talking about the technology of the automobile and how we got there. This is one of three major modules posted under week 2, and then there are a couple of additional modules which are mostly pictures with limited text. There are 2 modules to talk about: Electrify Expo, which is an electric car show touring through the United States every year, usually between May and October. For this area, the place is usually Nassau Coliseum, and in fact, it's there that you'll have the Electrify Expo this year, mid-October. I think it's October 13th. And so, in this case, look at the pictures, briefly glance through the comments that I posted there, because it gives you a sense of what the future of the automobile is, which is one of the topics for this week. So we start with this guy. Of course, you know who this guy is, right? If you don't, I'm sorry, then you lose points. His first name is Enzo, and his last name is Ferrari. Okay? So this is Enzo Ferrari in the 1950s. He was one of the pioneers of automobile racing. Famously, after he became an orphan, he sold one of the family's houses. The family was a middle to upper class family. He sold a house to buy his first race car. That's how much he committed to that. He was not a hugely successful race car driver. He raced at the end of the 1910s and the beginning of the 1920s. He found his niche, he found his talent as the manager of the Scuderia Alfa Romeo. And he was so successful with the official Alfa Romeo team that he later, when he wanted to be on his own, had some legal issues because he had signed a non-compete agreement with them. So initially, in 1947, he thought of producing cars not under his name, to have some shell company to protect him from the legal repercussions. And then by 1948, he decided to proceed, and nobody gave him any real trouble. So Ferrari thought about the automobile, and in his view, there is no automobile without wheels, right? Which, of course, anybody would agree with. And his idea was that we don't know who invented the wheel, right? And probably it's one of those inventions for which you have to think of a polygenesis of the invention, meaning that there wasn't a single place, a single person, but multiple individuals who came up with this idea. He said, so the idea of the wheel must have come from nature, because when you look at nature, you see natural objects rolling. For example, you see flowers, you see seeds of particular flowers that roll downhill very easily, and that must have given ancient men the idea for a wheel. It's nice, it's poetic, but Ferrari really was missing a key point, because if you went back in time, before the wheel was invented, I don't know if you've ever seen, are you familiar with the comedian Nat Bargatze? He's done SNL a few times, and if you look him up, of course, it's a bit older than you are, right? Must be in his 40s or early 50s. But he has a nice piece about going back in time, saying, if I went back to the 1920s, I would be of no help at all. My knowledge of the present, I could say, oh yeah, you have a phone, and in the future there will be small phones. Oh yeah, and how do you do that? I have no idea. And they communicate with satellites, and what's a satellite? Oh my God. Mm-hmm. So saying, yeah, I know what the future is if I go back to the past, but I don't know how to make it come sooner. Same for you. If you go back to some prehistoric era where there is no wheel, the knowledge of the wheel itself is not sufficient. The wheel seems very simple, right? It's like, oh, I'll give you this idea, and anybody really with rudimentary carpentry skills can build one, right? But that's not enough. You need something else that it's more complicated to have a vehicle with wheels. I'm not talking about the engine, right? I'm talking about the first carriage, right, which can be pushed by humans or pulled by animals. What else do you need to have such a vehicle? Yes, Scott.
Stabilization on
Stabilization seems very advanced. I have stabilization on my car, but
well, I mean like something where like the wheels are gonna move like together and like it's It's not gonna like
Backseat.
fall apart, like
So-
actually solid.
The wheels are not attached to the carriage in a simple way. In order to have a vehicle, you need both wheel and axle. And that's where the invention becomes complicated. Because if I ask you to draw, of course you know wheels, but if I ask you to draw a crude carriage that would advance, it's not that easy because you need, I don't know if by stabilization you refer to the fact that the carriage needs to be stable while the wheel and axle is rotating, right? And that's the complicated part, to have this combination. Here you see one of the earliest representations, and of course, probably carriages had been in existence a little earlier as well. So this is a Sumerian carriage, military for military use, and is dated around 2500 BCE, right? With animals that are not exactly horses, but they're related to horses. But as I show in here, and as you find on the class wiki, the wheel and axle, which can be applied in a number of situations, not just carriages. In here you see a very common ancient application of that, which would be a well with a bucket that goes up and down. The wheel and axle is one of the 6 basic machines that represent physical applications of the idea of a lever. And you see the other one, right? Just the basic lever, like a stick that helps you lift a rock in a way that is efficient, that allows you to multiply your strength. You see the pulley, which was essential to antiquity, especially within architecture. You see the inclined plane, for example, in the presentation about mobility, I mentioned how before trains with steam-powered engines, locomotive engines existed, tracks were being used with inclined planes to move goods up and down a hill. The wedge and the screw are other applications. So these are called simple machines that, keep in mind, in order to have a vehicle, it's not just the wheel, which is simple enough, rather it's the wheel and axle combination, which requires a little bit more engineering. After the Sumerian vehicle, we jump all the way to the Renaissance to find something relevant for the development of the automotive technology. And this is a page from a notebook by none other than Leonardo da Vinci. Now, Leonardo da Vinci is commonly represented in TV series, if you've seen the Medicis and other TV series, and known by almost everyone in the world as an inventor of the helicopter, of this and that. We know now more about late medieval engineers, and therefore we know that Leonardo almost every time did not invent, that the so-called inventions attributed to Leonardo can be found in other manuscripts from earlier periods. That is to say, those were ideas that were often never fully realized, but ideas that projects, prototypes in drawings that engineers during the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance kept in their portfolio, because engineers that were in demand would show their next boss, which was often a member of the aristocracy, a leader of a small state, what they promised to do, what their skills would allow them to do. This is a slightly different case. In this case, we find the partial drawings of a vehicle that is propelled by springs in a very ingenious way. You load the springs and then the vehicle will advance, and there seems to be some crude way to steer the vehicle. The first key point for this project is that it is partial, which is not unusual. Again, nobody really asked Leonardo to mass produce this. And in fact, it was produced only once that we know of. Then we also know that Leonardo really suffered from paranoia. He was afraid that somebody would steal his notebooks or just look at them and steal his ideas. And it might have happened at least once with a mirror, with a complex kind of mirror. So it's hard to say that this is a finished invention because we don't have all the parts. And whenever you go to a museum or a traveling exhibit, there was one maybe 15 years ago in New York City that came with all these models, including this. There are some museums in Italy where you can see that, these models. Those models require the intervention of a modern engineer to add the missing parts. And in fact, you can even buy a kit, at least a kit was being sold up until a few years ago, to build this in very light balsa wood. And I've included a link to a YouTube video that you find multiple YouTube videos of people who have built such a model about this big, and you can see it going. Now, is it a vehicle? Is it something close to, on the same continuum that leads to the invention of the automobile? Not exactly. Now, again, decades after this was found in a notebook, most of Leonardo's notebooks were found in the 1950s and early 60s. Now we know what it was used for. And we know that this time Leonardo did make at least one version of this. Leonardo was still a young person. It was the 1480s in Florence. Florence, in spite of the blooming ideology of the Renaissance, was still a pretty religious community. And they often had theatrical representations based on religion. So we know that this was not an actual vehicle, it was a theater prop. During a religious representation, at some point, this would be backstage, the springs would be loaded, somebody would pull a string to release the locking mechanism of the spring, and this cart advanced by itself, and on top of the bed, in here, there would be a plank. The vehicle itself probably was not bigger than 2 by 2 or 3 by 3 feet. And on top of the vehicle, there would be the statue of the Virgin Mary. And so the people would see this magically appear on stage, proceeding by itself. And it was a novelty, but it was a toy. And we know that Leonardo, especially as a young person, had a fascination with toys. We know that he realized flying birds. And in the Medici TV series, you see that, for example. So we know that Leonardo from the very beginning did not envision this as a means of transportation. And in fact, even with fully loaded springs, this could only advance 10, 20, 30 feet, depending on the weight that you put on top of it. And in order to cover any substantial distance, you would have to stop and reload the springs every few tens of feet. So, is it the ancestor of the automobile? Not exactly, but it's certainly worth mentioning, right? The problem with many of the so-called Leonardo's invention is exactly that there is no engine to make them function, right? The flying machine was supposed to be moved with the arms of the person lying on the flying machine's body, for example. But given the weight even of the lightest wooden structures, even trying to multiply strength with pulleys, there is no strength sufficient to make the machine fly, or in this case, make this go for a long distance or any reasonable distance. This is considered the real ancestor of the automobile. We're 300 years after Leonardo. We're in France before the French Revolution, and a military engineer by the name of Cugnot builds 2 or 3 of these tricycles with a steam engine in front. So in here you actually have an open fire, right? You place coal at the bottom of this cauldron. You place water on top. The water is heated to the point where steam goes through and moves these pistons up and down, moving these wheels up to a speed of roughly 2 to 3 miles per hour. Speed, however, was not the goal of this machine, because, and you should also notice how badly apparently the weight distribution is, right? Because you have this heavy engine here and nothing in the back, simply because in the back you would have had pieces of artillery guns, right? The actual barrels of heavy artillery pieces, they would provide the ballast. In fact, there are several replicas that you can see around in functioning order. And usually for the replicas, if I don't put anything, because it's hard to find, expensive to make a replica of an artillery gun, they would put some ballast water, for example, to make it. Clearly, there is a crude way to move this around. There is a lever, not easy to maneuver. We know anecdotally, no evidence, but we know anecdotally that one of these machines went against the wall. It's not difficult to imagine. And again, having an open fire near artillery guns, and where you have artillery guns, you need gunpowder, is not the safest solution. Anyway, we're in the 1760s with this machine, and it's clearly something that can qualify as a self-propelled vehicle, right? Automobile means something that moves by itself, not pushed or pulled by external sources. Again, it's not unique. In this case, we have the name of the inventor. We have drawings, and there are replicas in various museums of this vehicle. This must be, yeah, this is Paris. But we know that other people had tried something similar. For example, we have reports that a Jesuit during the 17th century in China had tried something similar. And this, again, is not a project, it's just a crude representation of what the Chinese vehicle might have looked like, and not even entirely believable. So in this case, we have the open fire, you have the water in this sphere, and the idea is that the steam would act as a wind sail, right? That the steam would push this mechanism and make the wheel turn. But again, no, it's not how you would want to do this. It cannot work this way. If anything, you put a sail if you want to use the steam as wind, but hot air is not ideal for a sail. This is another interesting example. By now we're in the 1800s. This is 1803 in London. You can clearly see they borrowed the body of a regular carriage. They put a big steam engine in the back, and you have a crew of at least 2, a driver and somebody working the engine, because you need to feed the steam engine with coal. You need to add coal to the fire. You need to make sure that the fire has the proper source. And then, of course, these wheels are giant, the same way that, are you familiar with the initial bicycles from the 19th century, the ones with a big front wheel? There are physical reasons why you would want that wheel where energy is applied to be bigger to achieve top speed for this kind of configuration, and then you have belts, etc. This was an experiment. It was used almost regularly, apparently. It seems like there was an accident, although the accident has been blown out of proportion. There are illustrations with people being thrown out of this carriage like birds flying in the air. We don't know if that's an exaggerated representation of that. And again, throughout the first half of the 19th century, you find similar experiments because steam engines were well known, but you can see that they're big, right? It's hard to make a small steam engine, at least at this stage in time. This is an Italian example, again, a military engineer who then left the army and became an architect and an engineer in civil society. Again, you have a huge steam engine with a seat for the person feeding the engine, the steam engine, with coal. You have the body of a regular carriage, of a coach for the passengers, and you have the coachman with a handlebar to steer this. And this was used, it was made, maybe a single one of these was made. This is 1836, right? And in fact, you find that in the Museo dell'Automobile in Turin, which is the largest automobile museums in Italy. You find a beautiful display of this. You can see how big this machine, you can get really close. And then they have this digital animation with fake digital horses in front that disappear because the machine can move by itself. The next step towards the realization of a car, since an open fire is not easy to handle and steam engines were, until the end of the 19th century, tended to be big, is the internal combustion engine. Again, a polygenetic invention created by multiple people in multiple areas. This would be the Italian version. We're in the 1850s. Barsanti Meucci, there is a museum in Lucca where you can see this. And this is pretty small, right? Like this big. So you can imagine putting this in a vehicle that is not too big and heavy. But to show you that there were multiple examples, in the 1850s, a Belgian-French engineer, Lenoir, made another internal combustion engine. And in fact, around this period, you find the first science fiction book imagining a future in which there are vehicles with this kind, propelled by this kind of engine. However, real progress for vehicles came from electricity, because you see here an 1899 prototype, single prototype, made for speed record, land speed record, called La Jamais Contente, meaning never happy, never happy with the speed it reached. And you see how manageable, how small and apparently agile this vehicle is. It's kept light, single-seater, because it has to move as fast as possible. And in fact, it is the first vehicle to reach 100 kilometers or 60-some miles per hour. But even before this vehicle, there were plenty of experiments with electricity. And keep in mind that during the first 20 to 40 years, especially 20 to 30 years of the automotive production, electrical vehicle occupied at least a third of the market, a third of the circulating vehicles. By 1899, in New York City, you would have found hundreds of electric taxi cabs. And in fact, one of the stories we'll read soon, during one of the first weeks, will be the story of someone inside an electric taxi cab that has broken its brakes and cannot be stopped. And they just have to go around until they run out of charge. Okay, so electrical engines and electrical vehicles were easy to manufacture. And during the 19th century, when you talk about machines, the machine for excellence at some point in the 1880s, when one said machine, the word machine, this is what they would think of. That is to say, the bicycle. Of course, this is not a 19th century bicycle. This is the rover, right? Or called also safety bicycle. This is 1886, and around the 1880s, the bicycle was done as a modern creation, right? If you compare this to a modern bicycle, in a modern bicycle, you can find a fancy transmission, you can find exotic materials, right? Carbon fiber, you can find an electrical engine added to it. But as far as the technology, for example, the shape of the chassis, everything here has a reason, has a purpose. The angle, the inclination for the handlebar, for the rear, the basic chain. This is beautifully made, right? You know that because even without a human, if you push a bicycle, this one or a modern bicycle, strong enough, the bicycle will go by itself for, depending on how strongly you push, for a certain distance before falling. Even in this case, so we look at the bicycle because the bicycle is connected to the technology of the automobile. First of all, it is the first symbiotic mobility device. That is to say, one where you become a single entity with the device, because you know how, for example, how do you steer your bicycle? Question, answers. How do you steer your bicycle? Colin?
With your arms and hands?
No, right?
You can
You do that only if you're standing or if you're going under 2 miles per hour. But once you keep going, you steer with.
I mean, you kind of like you have to use your body.
You just shift your body, right? So if you're going down a mountain, imagine. I love to go up the Apennines, which were right outside the city of my hometown, and then coming down at 50 miles per hour. But you just shift your body into the turn, right? And you're just one with the bicycle, okay? Now, so it's an interesting invention from many points of view, technological, social, etc. Even in this case, you have the claim that Leonardo, this is allegedly from Leonardo's hand in one of his notebooks, would have been the father of the bicycle and is listed as such sometimes, right? Now, compare this to the vehicle we saw earlier. What's the big difference in this case in terms of the style and the overall concept? And keep in mind what I told you about his paranoia, that he didn't want anyone to steal his inventions. What's striking, what's peculiar?
He like kind of left like it looks almost like an empty space between like the two wheels above the pedals.
Right, but you know, proportions in drawings can not be perfect, right? That's acceptable. But compare, what's the one conspicuous difference between what I showed you before and this drawing?
The seats at the rear wheel, so it's like not really balanced between the two wheels.
Yeah, which is fine, right? Very advanced.
Feels like doesn't it feels and I would say that this can exist.
Well, again, it's not perfect, but close to it. The big difference is that, in fact, as I told you before, if someone gave you the piece of paper that I showed you of that small vehicle, which was in fact a theater prop, you would not be able to produce it without adding parts. Not all the parts are here. In this case, everything is there. Not only everything is there, but there are more parts than the very first bicycle we know of, the Draisine from the early 1800s. That is to say, in this case, you find a complete invention. It's not just two wheels connected by a chassis with a seat, but you also have pedals, you have a chain, you have a handlebar, right? All the parts are there. You can make this. Now, the problem might be that try having a bicycle made of wood. It'll be heavy, right? Even if they made it out of metal, would come out as heavy at the level of metallurgy known to people in the age of Leonardo. As I said before, this was discovered in the 1970s, I believe. There were 2 pages of a notebook by Leonardo that were glued together. A scholar who went to Spain to a convent where he found this asked the good friars permission to open the pages. He did, and then later on he claimed that he had found this bicycle. In the 1970s, we knew the history of the bicycle. The history of the bicycle is that in the early 1800s, you find just 2 wheels and a chassis, no pedals at all, and you use your feet to advance, right, to give you impetus, or you go downhill with that. Usually there is no suspension. The first bicycles were also called bone shakers, right, because that would be the effect. And only by the 1880s, you find all these elements, the functional elements in a bicycle. So scholars of the history of technology, including myself, believe that this bicycle was drawn by the scholar who found it as kind of a prank. And what he might have found, as you can see here, were circles, right, that you see here in pencil, because this might have been the beginning of a cogwheel for Leonardo, who loved to draw cogwheels, and he, the scholar, added the other parts. The scholar died by the 1990s, so it was impossible to ascertain whether in fact this is a prank, but few people believe that Leonardo invented the bicycle. Now, bicycles became a popular form of entertainment, not just used for mobility, but people would flock in great numbers, even in the United States, to see bicycle racing on a wooden oval with bank turns called a velodrome, where bicycles, especially bicycles with multiple riders, would reach speed in excess of 50 miles or even faster. It was kind of dangerous also. What's interesting is that we know anecdotally that a lot of professional racers from the 1880s and 90s, then by the end of their career, when they were too old or fed up with this kind of circus, they transferred their skills and became chauffeurs, hired drivers for rich people. Why? Because again, they were familiar with the idea that you have a vehicle, both the automobile and the bicycle function in the same way, where you become one with the vehicle and you just know where the vehicle is going, right? You don't have to look at the 4 corners of the vehicle, etc. These were people who were not afraid of facing speed, high speed. And of course, they needed to have some engineering skills, because if you have a bike, if you've ever owned a bike, you need to fix the chain, and you needed to fix a chain on cars as well. They had chains, not belts, and other simple kinds of work. Of course, it took longer, however, to transfer this into a motorcycle, because a motorcycle poses other challenges. This is from the Mercedes Museum in Stuttgart, which opened in 2006, in May 2006. And again, the problem is that you have to make the engine small enough, you have to balance the vehicle. In this case, they added a third wheel, because otherwise the vehicle would not be sufficiently balanced. So this is what was going on right before automobiles became a thing. Before we look at the following history, and there is another presentation that I'll leave to you about what happened with cars during the history of this technology from the earliest years to the modern era, we'll look at mobility from another point of view, energy sources. So in this presentation, I have introduced various periods of time with the most common forms of energy available and widely used either for transportation or for the production of goods. And then what was the most advanced form of technology for this, for each era, etc. And you'll see that there are very few changes and up until the 19th century. So the basic energy sources during this period, 3,000 years before the Common Era, before the year zero, or year one, right, because there was no year zero, until 500 BCE, in order of importance, the most common energy sources were humans, right? For the longest time, and up until the 20th century, humans moved themselves, moved on foot. And humans moved goods. And humans produced work, right? For example, pulling a plow, pulling a cart. Followed by animals, right? Animals were a big source of energy for mobility and transportation. All kinds of animals that were domesticated in antiquity. Horses, donkeys, mules, camels, oxen, elephants, and dogs, of course. Water was also used as a source of energy for mobility, right? For the shipping of goods and humans in different roles, merchants, soldiers, etc. Meaning, if you are in a river, you can go downstream without any other source of energy. If you're at sea, then you need to you exploit the floating powers of a vessel, and then you add either rowing or sails, etc. I've mentioned fire here because I thought it should be mentioned, but of course fire at this point was not used for transportation, right? Just for heating. Wind became a big thing by the end of this period. And of course, we should mention gravity or pressure because that's how an irrigation system or an aqueduct works during antiquity. You don't have a pump with an engine. You just use inclines. For example, if you take a typical Roman aqueduct, going from behind Mount Vesuvius all the way to the end of the Bay of Naples in Misenum, they just built the whole aqueduct, which was 20 or 30 miles long, at an incline that was sufficient to move the water down, with reservoirs that would fill up to make sure that the water was flowing constantly. During this period, the newest, most advanced ideas for efficiency were the wheel, used in carriages, and carriages would then weaponize, right, used for warfare. The lever, especially cranes and pulleys, used both for carpentry, for architecture, and in terms of sheer efficiency, nothing in antiquity beats the bow and arrow. The bow and arrow develops with just human strength such an amount of energy that even an ancient arrow with an ancient bow can go through the metal of the body of a car, for example, or even go through part of an engine, right? There used to be tests done even on this campus by an anthropologist to convince people of how much energy can be developed by a bow and arrow. In terms of strategic work, operations, ships were the most advanced technology. The civilizations with ships were the civilizations that built an empire, right? And even the Romans did not become a larger empire until they made progress in their naval technologies. And of course, animals, right, as well. What they knew in terms of sheer knowledge but couldn't exploit was the power of coal and oil and steam. By the year 500 BCE, a lot of civilizations of antiquity knew about steam and built toys with steam, but they couldn't transfer that knowledge into something bigger or that did any work, right? Now, if you move past that period into the period of the Roman Empire, if you look at one of the largest empires of antiquity, you find that the energy sources have not changed. Still humans, animals, water, etc. Water becomes something used in more interesting ways. For example, the Romans had advanced water mills. And Romans made previous inventions more efficient. Roman pulleys, Roman aqueducts, the network of Roman roads were much more advanced, more efficient than in other civilizations. Nothing changed in terms of strategy. Ships really were the most crucial technology for an empire like the Romans to move troops, to move goods throughout the Mediterranean, right, and Black Sea. And something that the Romans knew a lot about, but never exploited fully, were cogwheels. We know that they were able to build some advanced mechanism, and you may have seen some of them even on YouTube. They were good with springs, but again, they didn't make anything. And they tried here and there windmills, but they made limited use of the wind for their mills. Probably a technology that was slightly too advanced for them. They were not fully understanding how to make that work. Now, if you move to the medieval era,
Thank you.
you find once again that the sources of energy are the same. There is just an increased emphasis on the use of horses, right? The medieval knights are the key part of the armies. Ships become bigger, right? Even the ships used by Columbus to travel to Central America were just medieval ships. And streams of water were widely used for water mills or even to activate shop tools. So if you went to a blacksmith in different areas of the world during this period, you would find hammers being moved by water and other tools as well. And they perfected the use of springs to make catapults. Even the Romans had catapults and ballistas, but the Middle Ages had better versions. And of course, from the bow and arrow, you go to the crossbow, which is very precise and very efficient. If you don't know what a crossbow is, you can find it online, same with the ballista. The biggest thing by the end of the medieval era are chemical compounds, right? They have flamethrowers. Wow. They have Greek fire, which is a complex compound. The composition was kept a secret, that could be used during naval warfare because it burned even on top of water. Okay, consider it the ancient equivalent of modern napalm. And of course, gunpowder, by 14th century it was discovered, and then gunpowder made artillery the most advanced strategic weapon of those armies. They didn't know exactly the qualities of gunpowder. They had a very rudimentary knowledge of it. They knew about steam, didn't know much about it, and they didn't know about some chemical reactions. Their explosives were very crude, and they couldn't really use gases produced by explosions in any efficient way. Now, you move to the modern era, and you find that on top of the other energy sources, you find that coal is being used for steam engines. And here you find the first big advancement. Oil is being used as well as natural gas. And the steam engine produces industrialization. So it's a strategic technology. Gas, with gas lighting, changes the habits of society. For example, sleeping habits changed by the beginning of the 19th century because of gaslight. Electricity gave them the telegraph, moving news, information at a very fast speed, and then electricity generated light bulbs by the end of the 19th century. Electromagnetism became a big source of energy used for electric batteries, and trains and steamships used the steam engine for mobility. The bicycle, of course, needs to be mentioned as a new kind of machine. What made or broke civilizations, empires, was the use of trains, which can be used militarily to move troops and supplies. Steamships, same thing. And of course, commercial goods as well. Assembly lines and dynamite. In terms of chemistry, by the end of the 19th century, dynamite can be used to build canals and tunnels. What they knew about, but never fully exploited in terms of mobility or other uses, was hot air balloons and dirigibles that were used mostly for entertainment. Mobile artillery, a few prototypes existed, but there was not a widespread deployment of such weapons. Machine guns, right, including the Civil War, and automata. There were some crude automata made with cogwheels during the 19th century. A famous one would be the chess player, although the chess player had a human inside. And submarines, of course. And you know that if you go to New Suffolk on Long Island on the North Fork, you find the place where the first flotilla of submarines was operating from at the end of the 19th century. I'm almost at the end. So when you talk about older technologies, you may think that they went out of fashion quickly at the beginning of modernity. But that's not true. For example, sailboats without an engine moved a lot of goods up until the 1910s. And that's very true for the American Northeast, for this area all the way up to Boston and Maine. Porters, that is, humans that were moving boxes, moving goods inside, especially inside urban areas, were widely used until the 1930s. That is to say, a large volume of goods were being moved by humans throughout the world. Horses were still used widely in the 1940s. World War II, even advanced mechanized armies like the German army moved half of their supplies and troops with horses and carriages. The American army used horses as well. Steam trains and steamboats were widely used until the 1950s throughout the world. And bicycles were used by tens of millions of people throughout the world up until the 1960s as their primary means of transportation. The last two slides are just all the small inventions that were needed in order for the first automobile to be built, and how various inventions and various technologies, as well as energy sources, came together for the realization of the